Hello, 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 and welcome once again to CorpusCast, the podcast from Aston University, all about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Robbie Love. In this episode, we're covering a topic that underpins much of what it means to do corpus linguistics, so to speak, but nonetheless can cause, at least for some of us, the occasional headache and maybe a slight bout of anxiety, especially if, like me, the learning curve can sometimes feel a little bit steep. However, I'm feeling brave enough today to devote an entire episode of CorpusCast to the role of statistics in corpus linguistics. And who better to be my guide than my guest today, Stefan Gries, Professor of Linguistics in the Department of Linguistics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Chair of English Linguistics in the Department of English at the University of Gießen. Stefan is a quantitative corpus linguist at the intersection of corpus linguistics, psycholinguistics, and computational linguistics. And he uses a variety of different statistical methods to investigate linguistic topics such as morphophonology, syntax, the interface of syntax and lexis, semantics, and first and second or foreign language acquisition. Stefan has been an advocate for greater statistical rigor in corpus linguistics for some time. And many of his publications and talks have challenged commonly held assumptions, I suppose you could say, in corpus linguistics around statistics. And he's always sought to improve the ways in which researchers apply statistical methods in a linguistic context. His books include Frequency, Dispersion, Association, and Keenness, Multifactorial Analysis in Corpus Linguistics, and Quantitative Corpus Linguistics with R, and among many other responsibilities, he is co-editor-in-chief of the journal Corpus Linguistics and Linguistic Theory. So in this episode, we'll be discussing a range of things around statistics, including Stefan's views on the role of statistics in corpus linguistics, the gaps that maybe still exist in how these methods are applied, and how he sees the field evolving in the future. So without any further ado, please welcome Professor Stefan Gries to the show. Hello, Stefan, and welcome to CorpusCast.
Hi, Robbie, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I've been hoping that we get the opportunity to do this for some time, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation to hear your perspectives on some of the issues that I just mentioned there. But to start with, I'll ask the question that I always ask my guests to begin our conversations on CorpusCast, and that is the question, of course, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Well, to me, it's probably what most people would say. So obviously, it's an empirical discipline. It's one that's relying on observational data. It's the idea that if we look at observational data as opposed to, let's say, experimental or simulation kinds of studies, that we have a higher degree of validity. So the idea basically is to find out things about language, how it's acquired, used, processed, how it changes, by looking at, hopefully, representative samples of data that have been collected, and have been made ready to process with whatever kind of tool one is using. And I personally, as you said, I have a big interest in doing this statistically, and I have a big interest in doing things that with corpus linguistics that connect to psycholinguistic and or cognitive kinds of aspects of linguistics as well. So that's my particular strand of corpus linguistics that I am most interested in.
And tell me how you sort of came to the position that you have now. You've been working in these areas for some time. So tell me a bit about your background. How did you get started, and when did you, I suppose, develop your interest in linguistics, and more specifically quantitative and corpus linguistics more generally?
So I did I originally studied to become a teacher of English, and I started studying directly after my time in the army, so like 93 in Hamburg till 98. And at the time that I started, I had no idea that linguistics existed or anything like this. It was a total crapshoot. I needed one more course to fill my to fill some requirement of mine, of how many credits I would gather in the first semester. And someone told me, oh, there's this new linguistics class that was offered that's not full yet. It's at this totally inconvenient time. He's still taking people. And so I went there, and it was just awesome. He was so great. He actually was not a professor at the university. He was just, a lecturer, big air quotes there. And he taught it in a way that's completely different. I've never seen anyone talk linguistics like this. I guess at the back of his head, he was like, yeah, semantics and pragmatics, that's all crap. We don't need this. We go for structure. And so it was like totally, phonology, morphology, syntax based with a theory that is definitely not mainstream. But I got hooked in the sort of argumentative parts of it, in the weighing opposing sides of an argument to explain a certain structure. And sort of from that first semester, from probably that first 2 weeks, already I was hooked.
So it was entirely by sort of serendipity then that you came, that you started studying this just by chance.
Absolutely, yeah. And I even dare say, and I say this with all respect, to my later supervisors and everything, I think it was even, that person taught it, and that person taught it that way. I mean, it hit something, it struck sort of a nerve in the positive sense, it connected with a lot of things that I am like, so to speak. And yeah, I think if he had not taught the class and did it the way he did, I might not have, I mean, I never liked literature studies, so I might still have moved on to linguistics rather than literature or culture or something like that, but certainly not with that drive.
And then that inspired you enough to carry on and do a PhD.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, exactly. So at one point, so I was studying to become a teacher, and then after 3 years or so, not something I should admit, but after 3 years, I changed to an MA because I couldn't possibly survive another literature course that was required for the teacher's exam. And so I changed to the MA, which is a totally career-wise stupid decision, because one could have done a PhD with the teacher's exam, right? So I basically cut off an option just for the pure hate of literature courses, which again, strategically, not the right thing to do, but I did. And so then at some point I thought, yeah, I can maybe try and do a dissertation. And it was also at that time that my interests in statistics basically started, because I read this one paper and one course of who became my supervisor later, and I didn't know anything about statistics, actually, like nothing at all. Mm-hmm. But that paper reported some very basic statistics, and on some total gut level, which probably was maybe even a little bit arrogant or something, I thought, there's got to be a way to do this better. Not like I know that way, but this can't be it. And then I just started reading all the stuff, and trying at some point, to do it better. And then I completed my PhD in 2000, also at Hamburg, and then started jobs and stuff.
So that was, because we'll talk about it more in a little bit, but my impression of you in the field of corpus linguistics has very much been since I first started. Obviously a bit more recently, was, Stefan Gries is sort of, how do I say this politely, often telling us that the way we do things is wrong, and this is why, and that we need to, or maybe could be done better is a better way of saying it. And it's interesting here that kind of, that interest in looking at how can this be done better has been there from almost the beginning, from when you first started studying linguistics.
It's what made it start, basically. Yeah, I think. I mean, it's again, maybe completely serendipitously, but that paper, maybe it was, in that zone of proximal development. It was some statistics, but statistics that I could still understand, even though. So I was, close to that, but it wasn't like over the head and maybe, scared me away or something. So it was much of what happened during my career is probably very, based on fortune.
I think before we go any further, we should probably, for those watching or listening who maybe not so familiar or sort of more have a peripheral interest in corpus linguistics, but predominantly work in other ways. When I sort of say, statistics and corpus linguistics, obviously this is a huge kind of area that we could talk about all sorts of very many different things. But if you can, I appreciate this sort of very broad, but how would you kind of, in broad terms, describe the role that statistics has in corpus linguistics? I know I'm sort of talking about these as separate things, and you might not see them separately, but what is the general kind of aim or contribution or value of statistical approaches when we're talking about studying language using corpus methods?
Yeah, it's a big thing. We have 2 hours, right?
I would.
Well, so first, I mean, I definitely do see them separate, right? I mean, I'm not, narrow-minded enough to say, there's no corpus linguistics that is not quantitative. Obviously, there are both kinds of approaches. I do think that, let's put it this way, looking at some phenomenon, X, obviously you can study it quantitatively, obviously you can study it qualitatively, for sure. I do think, though, that, and I think one can start either quantitatively or qualitatively. That too, no problem. I do think, though, that at some point, there's got to be some quantitative work on something, because if the idea is, to generalize, then I don't see many alternatives to at some point being quantitative, right? And so this sounds like I'm relegating qualitative, to this brainstorming kind of thing, which is not the case. But I do relegate qualitative to the realm, that is, that has the heading or the label or the box that says, more difficult to generalize from than the other kind of study, right? So then quantitative studies, and so that's basically what I'm hoping to do, and I do think that the tricky thing also is that the way I look at quantitative work, I mean, there's obviously different ways to do it, but my work at least is often qualitative in some way anyway. I know many people will balk at that perception, but what I mean is that, and I talk about this in the stats book, like if someone does a qualitative analysis of some conversation and says, here at this point, someone uses a certain expression with a certain intonation, which, constructs or indexes or whatever, this thing, then, that's a qualitative statement, perfectly fine. But then what I don't get is when people then balk at the idea that, well, I put that in a spreadsheet, and put it together with other cases and then run some numbers in it. So why is it that the first way of looking at it is oh my God, insightful, and the second one is oh my God, reductive, right? So I do think that one can definitely do this, and most of my quantitative work needs to start with something like that, annotation of expressions, sentences, discourse, whatever. But then I try to do the second step because I think generalization, theory formation, the improvement of theories needs to at some point take that route.
And so, I agree. I think I used to see much of a bigger distinction in corpus linguistics than I do now. In that, yes, my earlier sort of training or education was very much in the qualitative side of things, and looking at individual texts and looking at discourse and applying frameworks manually. And none of that has really gone away, but really now I'm just doing the same sorts of things, but on a bigger scale, I suppose, and inevitably involving counting them and making some sorts of comparisons where you want to be able to, I suppose, ascertain the level of confidence that you might have in the size or the meaningfulness of the difference between two different things or something. But it's still, it doesn't feel like I'm doing something completely different now. It feels like they complement each other very much. But I think the challenge, certainly for people like me, has been bridging that gap from still considering yourself a linguist, and a lot of, maybe not so much anymore, but certainly students who do programs in English language, for instance, not going to get a great deal of poor statistical input. And then suddenly I teach them a module in corpus linguistics, and we're talking about significance and effect size, if we're looking at keenness or collocation or something. And it's like, whoa, what this it feels initially completely, what's this got to do with language? And bridging the gap, I think, for me has been the hard thing of sort of that learning curve. And I'll ask you more about that in a moment. But
can I say one thing to that?
Yeah.
So I have the same things here, and in Gießen as well. A lot of times that people more or less explicitly say, I went into English or language, to not have to do this math crap. So now, why am I listening to this? And I mean, the answer that I don't usually give, but one thing that I often think in the back of my head is that, well, so it's still linguistics. You will learn something about language when we're done with the stuff you don't like. But one other way that I think of this actually and have put in writing elsewhere is that, I'm often polemic. So in the humanities, we often try to justify our existence to, political or administrative bean counters by pointing out that we teach people, critical thinking, blah, blah, this whole idea of an educated electorate or population, blah, blah, something, right? And I do think, and I know that some people, even who do qualitative work, agree that, statistical or probabilistic thinking is part of any kind of critical thinking one should have, right? I mean, if we in the humanities want to claim that, we make people able to, weigh different perspectives and stuff like that, then in the modern world, these different perspectives often include, arguments based on data, arguments made to politicians to fund X, Y, or Z based on data. And, you may not like it. I mean, not you personally, but, one may not like it, but, the science of data is statistics. So a certain degree of literacy in that, I think, is required. And I think that's how we can, at least to ourselves, maybe not to our students, but to ourselves, can justify to bridge the gap.
I think that's a good point. That increasingly you could expand it, even the world of fake news, or even the way in which people may take what was a legitimate study and spin, or represent data in a misleading way. And having that kind of, I guess you could call it, data literacy is a very important thing for regardless of what you're studying. I think related to that, I will ask more about how you teach this sort of stuff yourself. But I mentioned earlier a kind of broader point around how you've been pushing for improvements in what you might call statistical rigor in the field, in corpus linguistics, kind of quite generally. I certainly, my sort of impression anecdotally is that in the last, I guess it's been decade or slightly more than a decade that I've been working in this area, I have already noticed that things have really, moved in that direction quite a lot, even in 10 years. There's, my general sense is that there is more of an expectation of more sophisticated engagement and less tolerance for, I don't say getting it wrong necessarily, but making erroneous assumptions about statistical approaches. So it certainly seems to be getting, more rigorous. But I want to ask your perspective on this, and you can obviously give a bit of a longer view on how things have changed. Do you think we're getting to a point where generally speaking, we're working in a satisfactory way, or do you think there are still gaps in general kind of awareness or understanding of the principles that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so the biggest part of the answer is I think it's gotten much better. I mean, if I go back, 20 years, there was very, very little. 10 years ago, a lot of people were doing stuff. Now, like you said, many, if not most, papers are quantitative in some way, and not just the amount of quantitative work has drastically increased, but I do think also the quality. And obviously, I will take all the credit for it. Haha. No, just kidding. Obviously, I mean, I've been pushing for this, but obviously, it's. So I think it's gotten much better. Yes. I mean, I do still think there are some areas or some sort of frequent mistakes that I see when I, review papers or hear talks. But yeah, in general, the level has gone up considerably. A lot of students, people at the grad student level or, in the early postdocs or whatever, they now routinely get exposed to, classes like this, workshops like this, maybe one of my boot camps or whatever. So there's just so much more input, right? Like when 20 years ago, I knew hardly any department that had any kind of statistical training. Certainly mine didn't, and so by now this is just way more common. So
yeah,
the expectations are, as you say, much higher. Now there are also issues though sometimes, I think. And so one is that, and so obviously all of what I'm going to say now is, not consensus, but just my personal view on this, which may evolve as years go by. So one thing, for example, is that sometimes I think there is a tendency to push things too quickly. The best example I have for this is, so for example, this advent and then adoption of mixed effects models in corpus linguistics, right? So after Harold's book in particular, in 2008, and then that Journal of Memory and Language special issue on it, people, said, okay, we got to do this. And reviewers started, rejecting papers that didn't do it, right? And on the one hand, during that time already, and even, up to 5 years later, my 2013 stats book didn't include them. And the reason was that I thought, we're not there yet. There's still too much methodological debate to be had about, for instance, how do we include random effects? How do we do model selection if we do it at all? Blah, blah, stuff like that. But at the same time, there was already some fervor, on the side of editors and reviewers to say, you got to do this, right? And so sometimes I'm sort of a little bit worried that, it's too radical to say, it's the new shiny thing, run to it, of course, but at the same time, there's got to be the adoption of something needs to be tempered by the degree of certainty we have in that new thing, right? And if much of that stuff is still evolving, I think there is, what for lack of better terms might be called, like a grace period, during which, this thing will for sure end up as being the method of choice at some point, but we're still figuring out the details. So, I'm going to let you get away with, again, big air quotes, a fixed regression only for now, because the other thing isn't, we haven't figured everything out yet.
So
that's one.
And I'll ask you about any of this as well, but just for those who may be unfamiliar or perhaps, a little rusty or just otherwise curious, you're talking about the sort of move towards mixed effects. If you could sort of briefly just sketch, I suppose, the typical approaches prior to that, and then what mixed effects means for in practice for the sorts of analyses and comparisons that we're making between, I guess you're talking about comparing different groups of text or speakers according to categories of variability.
Yeah, so if one does a multifactorial study in corpus linguistics, one is very likely to end up doing some sort of regression. So, for example, if you look at an alternation of something, that's a lot of work that I have done. But also, if you look at the lengths of words as they are pronounced, a numeric response variable would be another thing. And if you have a scenario in which you think multiple things are co-determining, to use causal language when I shouldn't, are co-determining the behavior of the response variable, then typically you would run some sort of regression that can treat all these things at the same time, with a lot of caveats. and tell you, how important are things, are predictors, which of them are significant, and so on. Now, the big, to simplify things, the big one thing that mixed effects models does is it addresses one flaw that many of these kinds of fixed effects regressions have, namely that they disregard the degree to which data points are related, right? So if you have 1,000 data points, but the 1,000 data points were provided by 50 speakers, each of whom produced 20 examples, to use a stupid example, but then obviously all the examples that one speaker produces are related to each other by virtue of having been produced by the one and the same speaker, right? The example I always give that makes this super obvious is also not a great one, but it works. If you look at the generative alternation, off versus S generatives, but you're doing a learner corpus study, then learner A, might not know an S generative exists, right? So they're using off generative even if everything in the context screams, you should be using an S generative here, right? And a fixed effects regression would treat this as 20 completely different pieces of evidence against the S generative, so to speak, right? Whereas a mixed effects model would see, yeah, but wait a second, this is all the same person. So let's contextualize the information against that fact, right? And mixed effects models can do this for speakers. They can do that for lexical items, for example. And one of the things that is underutilized, other ways in which data points might be related. So, for example, uses of certain, frequencies of certain words might be affected, again, let's say in learner corpus studies, by, a bunch of people who are sort of different people providing different examples, but they all got the same topic prompt, as opposed to another group of people, who are otherwise comparable, but who got a different essay prompt. And so that might skew the frequencies with which something happens, right? So stuff like that. Or a really cool example in some early psycholinguistic study doing this, annotation guidelines for different corpora might lead to different frequencies of something being attested in a corpus, right? And so on some high level, one might say, annotation team, so to speak, is a mixed effect or as a random effect, because, the fact that this thing is rarer here is, well, part of it will be accommodated for by, they had guidelines that sort of made this a rarer thing, right? So that's basically what mixed effects modeling does.
And so, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm asking you to kind of briefly and in quite simple terms discuss things that clearly there's an awful lot of an awful lot more thinking going on in the background with these things. Would you say that this is still sort of an issue that the field needs to address better in terms of ensuring that analyses do take into account properly individual points, individual variation, as opposed to what you see very often is aggregate kind of comparisons of larger groups of, whether it's subcorpora or speakers using a particular form or variant. Is this something that the field in general, you think still needs to do more to ensure that is kind of bedded in as standard practice, not to, just take things at the aggregate level?
I definitely think it needs to happen more. Again, a lot of people, a lot of studies are now doing this right? The field has evolved there greatly, and compared to the usual glacial pace of everything in academia, it has done so pretty quickly. But there are still, I think, I still see a lot of studies in reviews, for example, that don't do this right. I think sometimes this can be said as drastically as that, or sometimes who do it, let's say suboptimally, right? So, for example, this topic example actually came from a paper I just reviewed 2 days ago, submission to some journal, I think, where people decided to do a fixed effects regression, and it was fine in the sense that they actually didn't have speaker information, for example, so they couldn't. I'm simplifying here and anonymizing, so that's not quite true, but it's something like that,
Yeah.
At the same time, there was a higher level thing that they could have used,
Oh, okay.
Right. So my review then said, okay, I get this part, why you're arguing for fixed effects regression is fine, but this other part, that's something you neglected. And of course, I don't know whether it's important or not, but you should. So, right. So, I mean, this is just one isolated example, but yes, I do think that is one of the few things that there are, I think, that need to be done more and sometimes better.
What are some of the other things you mentioned earlier that you think? I suppose maybe an easier way of asking is what are the big hurdles you think the field has overcome? You said that you certainly agreed that things have improved an awful lot. So are there any kind of really big milestones where you notice that researchers are not necessarily suddenly, but that the tide has turned on a certain practice, and you can see that researchers are more routinely doing something in a more appropriate way? Are there any sort of big examples where you I suppose we're happy to see that things have changed for the better?
I'm better at saying things that I still want to happen.
Well, that's fine. You can say them. That's okay. That's all right.
No.
What else?
That's not what
else is on your wish list.
No, let me try and answer the other question first. So,
okay.
Well, I mean, it may sound trivial at this point because again, many people are doing multifactorial mixed effects modeling, but I do think one thing that has been great in that evolution over the last 10-15 years or so is the realization that, to put it as polemically as I have sometimes done in workshops, that monofactorial studies probably don't have much to offer anymore, right? So there's probably nothing you can point at in linguistics or in corpus linguistics, that is determined by one and one only cause, right? So pretending that that's the case and doing a wonderful chi-square test on some data because obviously this is the only predictor of that other thing, that's kind of disappeared for the most part, right? And that's great, right? It really is, because especially dealing with noisy observational data, right? You might get away with a chi-squared kind of test scenario or something like that, if you have experimental studies where everything else that we know actually plays a role, has been held constant in the experimental design, right? But in observational data, you usually cannot do that. And so one great thing, obviously, is the fact that sort of by now, multifactoriality reigns supreme, and I think that's awesome. Second, the advent of the more widespread adoption of mixed effects modeling is a huge improvement over, over fixed effects regression modeling or other kinds of predictive modeling. So that's certainly great. I think also so if one does regression modeling properly, as again more and more studies are doing, that also presupposes a high degree of exploration before you start, because the data may need to be prepared and weeded out, and you may need transformations and you need to do conflations of stuff and whatever. And so as a byproduct, but as a great one, of many more people doing this kind of analysis, I do also think that we've gotten to a point where, on that level, at least, we understand our data better, right? If you read early corpus linguistic studies, early statistical corpus linguistic studies, let's say from the 90s, because they only did a chi-square test, right? And no disrespect, those were the times. Then, of course, that also means or can mean that, there wasn't much exploration of multifactorial relations, even just on a descriptive level. But now that people do mixed effects modeling, I hope, they spend the requisite time on looking at, can I even do this, and do diagnostics afterwards. And I think that will tell us a lot about the data that might get missed if you approach the data with I'm going to run a chi-square test kind of logic to them, right?
Something that I noticed that seemed, it felt like it almost happened overnight, and this is sort of slightly different area, I suppose, really, but something that felt like it happened very suddenly was that it almost felt like on one day, a lot of papers and researchers publishing, particularly in corpus-assisted discourse studies, everybody seemed perfectly happy with, generating, say, a keyword list and ranking your keywords according to log likelihood or some of the significance measure. And then suddenly, overnight, it felt like everybody realized, oh, that doesn't actually that doesn't necessarily help, and maybe we need a measure of effect size to do our ranking if we want to kind of try and look at the most keywords, right? Or now a combination of the two, use significance to filter out, and then among the remaining items that have passed the threshold for significance, you then use effect size. But it felt to me very sudden that suddenly, I even 10 years ago, there were definitely a lot of publications where you would routinely see a keyness list or a list of collocates or something where it was like, here is, they're ranked according to the log likelihood value or some equivalent. And that was sort of completely unnoteworthy. And then suddenly it felt like, oh, you can't do that. I wonder if that, maybe you were involved in encouraging people away from that, or maybe you noticed that similarly. I'm not sure, but I was curious as to whether that was something you sort of have felt change as well.
Yeah, I think there's I mean, like everything, there are, like everything evolving over time. There will be trends and there will be buzzwords and things, and that's not always a bad thing, obviously. And I agree with what you said. I do think sort of effect size sort of was a big buzzword I mean, it started to become a really big buzzword at one point in time, and made a lot of people aware of, okay, this is what they say, this is, so I mean, it's probably not correct to say it, but it seems sometimes like, as if, significance was the first buzzword, so to speak, right? Yes. People were doing chi-square test and something was significant and then they interpreted. And then exactly like you said, and with tons of simplification, obviously, but then, suddenly effect size became this thing, like, yeah, but the p-value isn't enough. What about the effect size and stuff like that? And that's something that, of course, can still be done a lot, with monofactorial studies, right? What's the effect size for a chi-square test result and stuff like that? And then I do think, again, huge simplification, but then I think something like multifactoriality became a buzzword, the realization, okay, now we have these two things, but now we also realize, I mean, now, of course, we've always realized, but we haven't analyzed it that way, that things are multifactorial. And then the next buzzword is probably something like mixed effects modeling. And the current buzzwords are probably, say this with no sarcasm, maybe a combination of something like, or maybe something like, Bayesian modeling, right? So there's this tendency to always, advance the next thing, and and of course, as academics, we have a sort of career-based publication increasing interest in doing so, to say, well, this past thing wasn't that great, so now the new thing is great. And so I think a little bit maybe now, Bayesian stuff is that, and just to say, I've used Bayesian myself. I have nothing against it, but I sometimes feel there's this little bit of, religious seeming fervor and saying, okay, that's now the new thing.
Yes.
Blah, blah,
yeah.
Blah. But definitely, again, to stop talking, I agree that effect size was certainly one of these things that, one of these recognitions of importance that moved the field along.
Yeah. I do want to, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I do want to ask you because I think it's fair to say you maybe have a little bit of a reputation, as I said earlier, for not being afraid to quite in no uncertain terms, assert your view on such matters, and maybe strongly encourage researchers to reconsider the assumptions they're making. I had a look on your meticulously detailed website, but I have to say you were probably the easiest guest I've had on all of the episodes to find information about you, and especially up-to-date information about you, because you really are very much on top of your web presence. So I appreciate that an awful lot. And so you've got a whole list of basically every talk you've ever given, and all of course, your publications. And I picked out a few, titles that maybe at the time, over the last few years, people might attend a boot camp or a workshop you've given, or a paper at a conference, and kind of prepare themselves to find out how much they don't know. There's talks like most dispersion measures do not measure dispersion. I mean, that's quite a provocative way of introducing a topic, right? Or the main corpus linguistic statistics, their problems and thoughts are resolutions. Improving statistical methods in corpus linguistics, some simple suggestions. And there's probably dozens of others as well, where you've similarly kind of made such propositions. And in a way, you said, joked earlier, and I get all the credit for it. But I think actually you do deserve a lot of credit for pushing things along in the way they have in the field, because you are one of the few sort of visible figures who are, repeatedly kind of ringing the bell and kind of saying, no, here's why this just won't work, and here's what you could do instead. So how do you what's your impression of the one who's on the other side, making these assertions and knowing that you're probably challenging people in a way that a lot of other researchers maybe don't do so directly? How do you feel that these kinds of initiatives and the talks that you give are received, and do you feel that people are kind of on board and open-minded, or do you get resistance, when you're up there kind of saying the thing that you've been doing for the last 5 years that you think works perfectly and has allowed you to publish all of this research? Well, I'm here to tell you it's a complete load of rubbish, and you shouldn't ever do it, and here's what you should do instead.
Yeah, obviously people love it. I get a ton of fan mail, and well, I mean, not to make this a super long answer, but I think there's several dimensions that one needs to distinguish in terms of what kind of feedback one gets. So to start with the positive side, in personal teaching contexts, like boot camps or workshops that I teach or classes, people love it. So, in boot camps, in my classes, whatever, and on occasions like this, I often take data from papers that were published. I change all the variable names most of the time. I change even it was an alternation study, and I make it like a politeness study or something. Just change everything around, and then show the analysis that was done, and then why I think it was wrong. And honestly, I think a lot of people told me they thought that was really great. Because it's actual data. Yes, it's distorted or changed, and anonymized, but it's actual data that were published with some analysis, and now they see, why it doesn't work, and they found that really helpful, blah, blah, blah. Now, in other contexts, not so much. I've had really, really senior people, people 10, 20 years career-wise senior to me, say, don't come to my talk. Or if you come, don't ask questions. So there they don't like it. Another big battle I've had with people is I'm not going to mention names here, but with editors of various publication outlets who would complain or who would encourage me to not take apart a particular study because that's not nice or something. But and then my usual response is, and it's a true response, and it's an honest response, is but if I don't do that, then everybody will just see the paper that I write or the claim that I make without that example, that concrete published example, this time not anonymous because it's in print. And then they will say, oh God, there he goes again, fucking number crunching BS. No one does this. We don't need this crap. Blah blah something. Right? You need to give people like, I'm not making this up to get a straw man for another publication. Here's the freaking paper that did it that way. And it's wrong for reasons X, Y, and Z. Right? So I've often had this battle too, because, we all want to be decent, but maybe I'm prioritizing, or I have prioritized in the past, at least, progress of the field a little bit more over decency, or, let's all, hug and be collegial. So there's very mixed responses. And I do think I mean, I get it, of course, right? I mean, who wants to be, taken apart? I get it, right? I'm not like some, mindless automaton that doesn't see that that's obviously annoying. At the same time, I don't know how many people know this, but I do always give, there's a set of examples I always give in my classes here, UCSB at least, and in boot camps. There are places where I made mistakes, right? Maybe to put it out here in the podcast, my very first publication, Cognitive Linguistics, 1999, that analysis is a piece of shit. It's completely wrong. And no one noticed at the time. I didn't know anything, right? That's when I had just started doing statistics. Obviously, the reviewers didn't notice. It's BS, right? And in the dissertation book, 2003, later I have to say, yeah, that was BS. It's wrong, right? So stuff like that. I just give one other example, and again, just to put this out here, so that people realize it. Like whenever I teach about, regression summaries, I talk about 1 and 2 tail p-values. And the best example I can give for someone at one point not doing the one-tailed analysis they could have done to get a perfectly legit, significant result is a paper of my own, where I didn't do it, where I ended up having to say, this is marginally significant. It doesn't quite make the cut, but it goes in the right direction. When, if I had my wits together, I would have said, yeah, but we had this hypothesis. So actually it is significant. Right. Oh. So I know how it is, to do this incorrectly, but. So
you're an equal opportunist, critical academic, in the sense you're as equally willing to highlight the limitations of your own work in the past, as you are, in not in any personal way, of course, highlighting limitations of other research.
I wouldn't go that far. That portrays me as too noble. Of course, I'm not an equal opportunist. Of course, I prefer pointing out other people's mistakes than acknowledging my own. So
I try to help you there.
So I think I'm a 95 to 5%, pointing other people's stuff out.
Okay.
No, but okay. I mean, right, because I get it, but all I mean to say is, that it's not like, I'm not even thinking I'm always right, because obviously I'm not, right? And I'm also not always thinking, this is the one right way to do it, and I happen to be the one who knows it. Obviously there will be ways in which I've also had papers, where I reanalyzed previously published data by myself, and say, okay, look, this is better, right? I just think that it's important, like I said before, I think it's important to make these cases based on concrete examples, to not get this, there he goes again, eye roll, this never happens kind of argument.
Well, I may come to regret this, but if you if you ever start to run short of papers with possible statistical limitations, to put it lightly, or assumptions that may fall out of date if they haven't already, then I may regret saying this, but I give you my consent to take any and anything that I've published and have at it, as long as you maybe tell me about it so that I can actually learn something as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'm not. Just to make it very clear, I'm not reading. So it's not the case that much, or actually any of my work consists of hunting for mistakes, right? So
of course,
my workday doesn't. Well, sometimes people are so, are so riled up by sort of a critique of mine or something that I think they think that, but it's never the case that I'm like, okay, who am I to rip to shreds today, or is there a study that is particularly egregious and that I can, dump on? It's never like that, but in a sense, I think that is what makes some of the stuff more credible, right? Because it's stuff that I read anyway. So it's sort of a random, I mean, it's not random, really random, but semi-random sample of stuff that I read as I do my research, and then I see these things.
Now, there's so much more that I'd love to ask you about this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to condense a few other things that I want to ask about. But I think the most important one, and you did mention this earlier, I want to come back to the ways in which you approach teaching this, particularly to students who are new to this, and it's something that I sort of wrestle with in my own teaching as well. What are the typical kind of challenges for students at any level who are you're introducing them to quantitative that are beyond their existing experience, and what are the ways that you try and scaffold this to make it accessible, and what in your experience are the most effective approaches to kind of encourage students to have that light bulb moment of, I get it now? Have you got any any pearls of wisdom about things that you've found have tried and tested over the years?
It's tricky. So maybe just for background, it's really tricky to answer because of some of the conditions that I'm teaching in here. I mean, mostly at UCSB, of course. So one is that, and it'll become clear why I mentioned those in a moment. So one important thing here is we're not on the semester system, we're on the quarter system, which is only 10 weeks as opposed to 14 or 15. So while the sessions in the week are longer, it is a fact that you have typically much less time to go over some things. I mean, just look at it like this. Basically in terms of number of weeks, at least, 2/3. When you still have a third to go, I'm kind of done. And that often also means, if there's a term paper or something involved, I got to get I got to get the students to a level where they can do something, as of week 5 already, because they need a few weeks to think, okay, what do I want to do? Right. And then also they have like 2 weeks after those 10 to submit something. And then the grades have to be in. So it's not like in Gießen, for example, where, I can teach and then they have 3 months till the next semester starts. Right. So everything is very much compressed. So the conditions here in that regard are really, really difficult. And so for example, the corpus courses that I teach here, they are mostly methodological, because there's just not a lot of time to also read, different studies, corpus study in semantics and pragmatics and syntax, morphology, whatever. Right. I mean, I always give examples for these things, but it's not at the same level of detail that the semester system would afford me. Now, the other thing that is relevant to know here, sort of the disadvantage of what I just said being said, there's also, at least on the undergrad level, there's a really nice setup here because we have a whole family of courses that get people up to a certain level. So we have an intro to programming course. We have computational linguistics 1 and 2. And then on the undergrad level, we have statistics 1 and 2, and then a corpus class. So people usually come in with some awareness of a lot of methodological things already. And so that helps a lot. Now, the one of the biggest things I think that helps, especially teaching statistics for corpus linguistics, is to give examples that are not linguistic, right? Because if people struggle, if people haven't taken a lot of sort of core linguistics classes yet, then of course they will struggle with, not only seeing that method, but also seeing it on a phenomenon they're not aware of or haven't been aware of before. In that sense, COVID was a godsend. So because suddenly people were aware of, false positives and stuff like that, right? I mean, however, obviously terrible that was, it increased a lot of people's literacy in these things, because suddenly they read about, okay, this test gives you this many false positives. It gives you that problems with recall. Suddenly people were all into, sampling, so this was not tested on old people. So, for people like me, it was like, yes, thank you for all this concrete material to work with, with big air quotes, obviously. But so something like that. So giving examples that relate to things that people know well. I do use, like for predictive modeling, I often use examples that involve COVID or vaccination or cancer screening, or, luggage screening at the airport. Does the machine see that there's a bomb in there because they're testing TSA performance and stuff like that. So I think that helps a lot, because people suddenly, they make connections on that level at least, and then it makes it easier to bring the same kind of connection to something that they now also have to deal with, linguistic stuff with. At the same time, and this is maybe a sign of our times, a little depressing, a big thing that one needs to teach also, I think, is this, I don't even know how to express this well, although I've been thinking about it for years. It's like this ability to say, I thought X, but the data say otherwise.
Okay.
Like obviously right now, this is a big issue in politics. We're approaching a presidential election here, with one candidate maybe being less truthful about a few things than others. And so what is often difficult is, students approach a phenomenon and you introduce them to, I have this hypothesis, and then the data say otherwise, and then you need to educate them to, well, that's what the data say, you do let's say you do a chi-square test, whatever, stupid, but on these 200 examples and it doesn't work out, then the strategy isn't, but I still think so, and look, there's 5 examples where that works really well. It's like, but you adopted the logic of statistical testing, and so now it doesn't work out, right? It doesn't even mean you're wrong, right? It just means, it could be anything else, but this result, that's it. You got to suck it up that this time your hypothesis didn't work. Write a big discussion section why that might be the case, what the next steps are, but you gotta own it, right? And so that's something that I often come back to in courses. I often pick examples so that things don't work out, or they only work out in a part of the data, as part of a strategy to teach what interactions are and stuff like that. And so to teach people this, like, you want to believe this, but with this data set, you can't. That is a big challenge as well. That again actually goes back a little bit to what we talked about earlier. this data literacy and this critical thinking that we always tout we do in the humanities. Critical thinking also means, I got to critique maybe my own sampling process here, or my own annotation here. It didn't work out this way. These are the next steps. So those are things I think are really important in terms of teaching, because then the rest is like, they got to learn functions. There's programming kinds of things to teach and whatever. But I think there are well-established solutions for this. Whereas for some of these other things, it's harder to teach them because they don't. Because accepting them and accepting the mindset of a scientist who came up with data that don't support your stuff, that's something that's closer to one's, to use the overused word identity, right? People tend to stand with their opinions, and then if the data say but no, it's harder to. Students really often ask, like, but do I have to say now that it didn't work? Didn't work in the sense of didn't support it, like for a term paper or even an honors thesis, or can I just, and I'm like, no, you cannot just, this is the result.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a big challenge sometimes.
Yeah. Well, Stefan, thank you very much. This is brilliant advice, and I think a good point for us to draw our conversation to a close before we do end up going on for 2 hours, as we joked about at the beginning. But thank you. This has been fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners will have gotten an awful lot from this conversation. So thank you, and I will, of course, thank our CorpusCast listeners who have stuck with us for almost 3 years now. Would you believe it? Thank you all for joining us, however you watch or listen to us, as always. And do, of course, as always, let us know your thoughts about each episode, this and all the others, using the hashtag CorpusCast. And you can check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics research group on X at Aston Corpus. And you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. So thank you again for listening. And thank you once again, Professor Stefan Th, for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks so much for having me. I had a good time.